diversity and inclusion. My name is Miguel Rivera, and I'm the cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi. And we are so excited to have education leaders join tonight's event, the Ministry of Education, alongside other esteemed educational institutions. I would like to thank Special Olympics for your collaboration and efforts in bringing this event together. Also, a very special thank you to Professor Andrea Capizzi, Associate Professor of the Practice and Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Special Education at Vanderbilt University, who will discuss the importance of creating an inclusive classroom environment that tailors teaching for all learners, provides support, and creates high expectations for all students to enhance the lives of individuals with disabilities. Before I turn over to Professor Capizzi, I would like to invite everyone in the audience to submit their questions in the chat box at any time during the event. Our moderator will be monitoring those questions and will put them to the speaker during the discussion. I would also like to remind you to mute your microphones to avoid any disruption of the event. Now over to you, Professor Andrea.
Thank you so much, Miguel. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to be speaking with all of you today. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background. I have taught in public education I taught for about 9 years in classes with students that had learning disabilities and significant behavioral challenges. And I worked in both pull-out settings as well as inclusive settings and supporting students in those inclusive settings. And I am very, very committed to ensuring positive educational environments for all students. I've been teaching at Vanderbilt for about 15 years. In our Department of Special Education at Peabody College, and really see this as a true calling and a joy. So it is a true pleasure to be speaking with you today. So today we're going to talk quite a bit about providing and creating inclusive environments for students with a variety of disabilities in schools. And it's a lot of information to fit into a very, very short period of time. So I've prepared a resource guide with extra links and support information that you all might find helpful. You will receive this in an email in a couple of days that will follow up this session. So you have that, as well as I am also putting my contact information in the chat for all of you so that you have that as well. You are always welcome to reach out to me if you have any particular questions. And if I can't answer them, I'm sure one of my colleagues at Vanderbilt could. So please feel free to reach out to me. So we're going to start off today or this evening. For me, it's bright and early in the morning. For you, in the late afternoon, evening. I first want to talk to you about the variety of disabilities that we have in classrooms. So this may range from students that have intellectual disabilities to physical disabilities, sensory disabilities such as hearing or visual impairment, early developmental disabilities, and then of course those that have disabilities of learning and have average intellectual functioning but have learning challenges, as well as those that can sometimes be the most difficult in the classroom, those with socio-emotional and behavioral difficulties. And of course, any and all of these disabilities can go together. So we have students that have multiple needs in our classrooms as well. And so in the United States, we provide educational support to school-age students with disabilities. So students from kindergarten through graduation and even beyond graduation. We also have supports for young children, birth through age 8. So we're talking sort of two different groups of populations of students. But in order for students to receive services in the US, they have to meet federal educational disability categories. So in the K-12 space, the sort of school age space, we have 13 different disabilities for which students can meet criteria. And so those also range from intellectual disability, blind visual impairment, traumatic brain injury, learning disabilities, and emotional behavioral disorders. But even if students don't have multiple categories, they can still get services. So for example, you might have a student who has a learning disability, but also has some behavioral needs. And so we can still provide behavioral support even though they're only meeting criteria for learning disabilities. So we don't solely deliver services based only on those categories, but students do have to meet criteria. And the majority of students with disabilities spend all or most of their day in general education classrooms. So classrooms where they are not fully seen by a student, a teacher of students with special needs, so a special education teacher. So most of their education actually comes from teachers who are prepared in general education. So when we think about that, and we think about the wide range of students and their diverse learning needs, it's so important that we create environments that are supportive of students who have all of these varied disabilities and needs. So today we're going to primarily focus on supporting students with learning disabilities and emotional behavioral difficulties. But these strategies actually will apply to students that have intellectual disability, that have attention deficit disorder, that, you know, a lot of our students that have attention deficit disorder actually qualify through what's called other health impairment in the US. So it will support those students, as well as students that have intellectual disabilities, because the strategies that we'll talk about are not only good and supportive for students who have disabilities, but really supportive for all students across the board. Even those that are gifted can benefit from these strategies. So really these are strategies that can be used with all students, but definitely support those students that have disabilities. We spend a lot of time talking about universal design for learning in certain spaces in the United States. And if you think about what's universal design, UDL, these are all strategies that fit within that context as well, in case that's something that you know about or are focused on. And when we think about inclusive settings in particular, these are settings that students with varied learning needs and behavioral needs are taught in the same classroom and in supporting classrooms that are provided for students who don't have these specialized needs. And the idea is that the supports come to the students within those classrooms, as opposed to the students always being taken out of the classroom. And one of the benefits of really tremendously well-supported inclusive classrooms is that every child in the classroom benefits. So that we see that students with disabilities are actually able to learn at a higher level. They have higher levels of achievement, whether that would be social achievement and social support and social ability, or if it's academic. So we see that those inclusive settings really kind of push all students to a higher level. It is also wonderful because the students around the students with disabilities learn how to support those students as well. And we find that students, the more exposure we have to individuals with disabilities, the more comfortable people are working with those individuals and supporting them not only in the school setting, but also in the home setting, in the community setting, in the work setting. And it truly is something that can help us sort of within the school setting, but also in society at a broader space. So when done well, inclusion and the supports along with it really benefit everyone in the classroom, not only those with learning and behavioral difficulties. Does anyone have any questions about sort of what inclusion is as a whole? Oh, Hala, you're muted.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
Really bad about that.
It's the joy of Zoom. So.
It is the joy of Zoom, right? These are our problems nowadays. So we have a few questions that came through before. And one of the questions is about, could you sum up sort of the basic elements of inclusive education?
Yes, that's a really wonderful question. So inclusive education can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But the general idea is that we are supporting students that have disabilities and students who don't have disabilities in the same classroom space. So really thinking about how we can create environments where all individuals can learn together. for inclusion to be, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but for inclusion to be effective, it is important that we have special educators and general educators that are working together in their planning of instruction, as well as the delivery of instruction in classrooms. And it is also important that we make sure that the staff and the faculty at schools are all trained and understand general information about disabilities, as well as basic strategies for supporting individuals.
Great, thank you so much. Another question, you spoke a bit about learning disabilities.
Yes.
Now, can you explain learning disabilities? Do they negatively impact a student's intelligence, or are they differences? Learning differences?
Yes. So in the United States, we categorize learning disabilities different than we do intellectual disabilities. So intellectual disabilities are disabilities that actually have to do with intelligence and general cognitive functioning. So those would be individuals who have intellectual or IQs that are well below average, meaning very well below average. So when we think of an average IQ of 100, these are individuals who, based on the state in which you live, have IQs of 70 or below. And some states go with 65, so quite a bit below average. Learning disabilities, on the other hand, are individuals who have average range or even above average range intellectual functioning that are struggling with learning. So they have intellectual ability that would predict that they would be successful with their learning, but there is something else going on. So we know that there are learning disabilities across a variety of areas. So there are reading disabilities, reading learning disabilities, writing learning disabilities, and math learning disabilities. And just because you have one of those doesn't mean you have all of them. So reading and writing tend to go together, which makes sense. But there are plenty of students who are really well skilled in reading and writing, but struggle with math. So that's a little bit different, but the difference between intellectual disability and learning disability is that intellectual functioning.
And that's a very important distinction to make, I imagine, to ensure that students with learning disabilities are getting the instruction that they need.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
thank you for clarifying that. Before, there's one question that just came through on the chat that I think is very timely. So still being under the effects of the COVID pandemic, do you have advice for how educators can create, learning environments online specifically for students with disabilities?
Yes, that has been a very challenging piece with COVID, and you use a lot of the same strategies that you use when students are in person. The challenge with a lot of students who have learning difficulties or disabilities when you're online is trying to create that engagement with the students and keeping the students interested. So oftentimes, it will require a parent or a caregiver to be with that student to help them to do different skills. It also requires a lot of interactive use of technology. So it might be using things like Padlet or a Google slide, or it might be some sort of an interactive learning system that has been used, but it is very, very challenging. But I'm going to write myself a note right now and actually add some resources related to providing support online for students with disabilities, and make sure that you all have those as well. There are a couple of different resources that have come out federally, but also we have a really lovely group here in Nashville that's called the Diverse Learners Co-op, and they have created some really phenomenal resources to support students online. So I will make sure we get that as well.
Thank you. I think that would be very well received. I know
Wonderful.
that unfortunately students with disabilities are still online at a higher rate.
Yes.
So it's still needs to be a challenge. We have another question that I really am interested in to hear your answer to, because it's something that I work with on a daily basis. How can we train mainstream students, so neurotypical students, to take part in this inclusive process and
Yes.
accept special education students?
Yes. And a lot of that comes with creating an environment in which everyone feels accepted. And we know that teachers and adults in the building actually model this behavior for students. One of the things we'll talk about in a bit is literally that creating that environment that sets the stage. But if students see that teachers value and support students who have disabilities or learning differences in general in the classroom, it doesn't even have to be a student with a disability. It could be a student who's just struggling, or it could be a student who maybe is a little bit busy or active in the classroom, and it tends to be a little bit more difficult to teach. If students see that teachers appreciate and support those students in a positive manner, it tends to increase that in students. It is around that student. But it is also extremely important that whenever teachers and adults in the building see students who are being kind or being supportive of a student who is struggling, that the teachers spend time providing reinforcement, telling those students that are being supportive and kind how wonderful they are, and recognizing that. And what we see is that also encourages those students to do more of that. And the interesting thing is that we often think about this only for young children, but it's highly effective for adolescents as well. So if we provide those reinforcements and that appreciation for those students who do step up and are especially kind, it can increase that and expand it in your classroom.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Everyone can keep the questions coming, and
yes, please.
we'll come back to them in a bit. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So now I want to move into discussing ways that educators can advance and support an inclusive environment, because educators, all educators in the school, teachers, school leaders, any classroom assistants are truly vital to advancing an inclusive environment. It takes a shared belief from everyone in the school that all students can learn and that all students are valued. And this is across all populations. It can be students who have intellectual disabilities, students who have physical disabilities, students who have learning difficulties, or my favorite students, which are usually most people's least favorite students, are the ones that have really challenging behavior in classrooms. The ones who might be a little bit disrespectful or talk out a lot in class. If we value all of those students and we show everyone around that we value them, it's so important. So that it takes this shared belief. So the way that we expand and create this shared belief in our schools is to teach all of the adults in the building that not everyone learns the same way. We know that all individuals have unique traits that make them learn in varied ways. Some of us really love to have everything audio. Some of us like it all visual. Some of us need to have something explained to us multiple times, which was the case in my case when I learned calculus, right? I needed a lot of extra help to get it until I got it. Still not my favorite subject, but I can do it. But we all learn differently. And we also need to make sure that general education teachers, as well as school administrators, understand various educational disabilities and that they have basic understanding of how to support students in varied learning environments. One of the resources that I've provided to you is an overview of different types of disabilities, as well as the characteristics of those varied disabilities. So it's very useful to make sure that everybody in the building understands that. And if you have students that have particular disabilities in your building, making sure that everyone who's working with that student understands the characteristics of that disability, as well as basic supports that can be provided to increase the chances of a successful environment for those students. It also requires a shared belief that all students are worthy of a positive and supportive educational environment, so that classrooms themselves are structured and designed to support all learners' behavior and learning in the classroom. So really this belief that your educational spaces are for all students, not just the students who are higher level learners. So creating these environments that are supportive to neurodiversity in the classroom. And the other piece that is vital for positive inclusive settings is adequate staffing. So oftentimes we push inclusion into classrooms and we say this is going to be an inclusive space, but we don't provide enough supports in the classroom. So we really need adequate staffing and also joint planning. So it's not okay just to have multiple people in the classroom. Those people have to work together to plan instruction. So in a perfect world, in a perfect inclusive setting, ideally we would have a special education teacher and a general education teacher co-teaching, working together. So we would have these two people working together in the classroom, not only planning instruction, but also delivering instruction, so that all of the students in the classroom see both teachers as their teacher. So it's not just the special education teacher only works with the special education students, or the general ed teacher only works with the general ed students. Everyone works together to support all of the students. And when this is done really well, we see that achievement actually increases for all of the students, both of those that are neurotypical as well as those that are neurodiverse. So we really see that, but it's very challenging and it does take a lot of time. And this these multiple levels of support and multiple people in the classroom really can have an additive effect to the environment. This most effective co-teaching model really has the two of them together, teaching at all times, but sometimes that's not possible because we often don't have enough people that are well trained in special education. So most people will say, well, then how do I do it? You can still do it, but you still need a special educator planning with the general educator. And then you need some sort of a classroom assistant that is well trained, that's also a part of that planning. So oftentimes what will happen is the special educator will go into the inclusive classroom for the core subject areas, the reading, the writing, the math. And then they'll have some sort of a support person that's involved for other subject areas, such as science and history / social studies, or even art or music. So they might be in that space with them. But the more you could have the special educator who's trained alongside the general educator, the better, really very much the better. And when we are thinking through this, if you see that the educators as the backbone of making inclusion work, but that all of the other individuals in the environment also are vital to creating these supportive spaces, it really enhances not only the academic learning, but it also enhances the social-emotional learning. So the learning how to interact with others on both sides, the students with disabilities and the students without disabilities. It also can increase the likelihood of positive interactions in the classroom and decrease the likelihood of problem behavior in the classroom. So it's really has such a multifaceted sort of positive interaction and work with the environment. So the more we can train everybody and the more everybody can actually work together, the better. Hala, are there questions about this?
Yes, there are. Thank you so much. I love your term and your explanation about shared belief, because that's obviously so important. What would your advice be for an educator that maybe did not feel that they had the support that they need? What are some strategies that they could use to discuss with their administration the need for support?
Oh, that's such a wonderful question. I think that a lot of teachers often feel that they don't have any ability or power to share their needs, or they feel like they're not being heard. I think one of the most powerful things that a teacher can do is to collect some data, right? So I'm all about data. And it doesn't have to be really difficult data. You can just keep track of challenges that you've seen in the classroom and anecdotally write them down. If you have a student who is struggling with some sort of an academic skill, sharing your grades or the data that you've collected and sharing that with your administrators, along with the information about what you have done and you've tried. Because if you go to your administrator or your school leader and say, oh, this student is really having trouble in reading, they aren't reading well. That has a lot less power and a lot less weight behind it than if you go to the administrator and you say, look, here are the students' reading skills. Here is what I have tried. I've tried this, this, and this, and I need someone else to help me. That can be a lot more powerful. Same thing with students who have, and like I said, I always like to bring up the kids that have behavioral difficulties in the classroom. If you talk about, oh, this student is so difficult, that means very little. But if you say this student talks out in the classroom 18 times an hour, or if you say, and you just take tallies of that, or if you say this student has been disrespectful this number of times, and here's what that means in my classroom, or this student has had outbursts, and then you give them that information and say, I've tried this, this, and this, I need more help. It tends to get that administrator's attention more, and they tend to take you a bit more seriously. Paula, do you think that covered it? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. No, I think that's great advice. Data is always power, and as you said,
Very
I think
much.
it's very, very convincing when you have data to back things up. Now, a very interesting question that's come through the chat from Stuart Ferguson saying, following a year of online learning or more in many cases,
Yes.
do you think that core skills such as English, math, Arabic here in the UAE should also shift toward modern skills such as IT and computing, as these skills could be developed for vocational and academic growth? So what are your thoughts on that?
So my feeling is that, yes, I think we need to stay current, but we can't do that at the expense of core basic skills. Students still need to have a solid understanding of math. They need to have a solid ability to read and write. We know that the more that we focus on solely digital-based platforms or even computing skills or IT skills, students are much more successful in those if they have strong skills in the basics. So I would say yes, but don't forego the basics.
So we're adding an add-on.
It's an add-on, and I think
right.
it's an add-on, but I think you can add it on in a way where you're integrating them. But I think that also takes a lot more creativity. But we know that especially let's think IT and computing skills, they take a lot of reasoning, right? And so and reasoning is a higher order skill, and we know that a lot of our students that have learning difficulties have trouble with that reasoning piece. So the more that we can build those skills at a younger level, at a younger age, the greater likelihood they are to be able to apply them as they get older.
Great, thank you so much. All right, well, as before, please keep the questions coming. We'll stop again in a bit.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
So now I'm going to move into discussing just a few strategies to support students who have learning differences. This was very hard to put together because I had a hard time selecting the ones that I wanted to share with you because there are so many, but I thought I would hit some of the high points in what we call evidence-based practices. So practices that we know have been supported through research and practice. We also refer to some of these as high leverage practices, meaning that they are practices that not only help students who have disabilities, but that actually help students who are neurotypical in the classroom as well. So we want to make sure that whatever we're doing in an inclusive setting is lifting the whole classroom. And so when we think about these, first and foremost, it goes back to that discussion that we had earlier on in this time frame, where you have to set up an environment where all students are valued and appreciated. So one of these challenges are that, because many people have very little experience in inclusion and learning diversity, they really don't understand or know how well students with learning disabilities and behavioral challenges can actually make significant progress in regular classrooms. So the very first thing we have to do is to create a culture of understanding and acceptance. And this is done through educating staff on disabilities, teaching basic strategies to support all students, and teaching those to everyone in the school. Families are also very important. So we need to make sure that families know that you value all learners in your school equally, including those that have learning struggles. So, and that is important not only for the families of students who have disabilities, but all families in the community. Because families learn that if you care about one child, and they see you care about a child who maybe has some struggles, that there's a greater chance that you're going to care about their children as well, regardless of whether or not they have learning difficulties. So very, very important. One of the resources that I have provided to all of you on this sort of overview resource guide that I have is for the IRIS Center. So the IRIS Center is funded by the U.S. Department of Education, and they have incredible web-based learning modules about inclusion, disabilities in general, specific disability areas, as well as academic and behavioral interventions that you can use in the classroom. And it's fully free, and it is a tremendous resource that's all based on evidence. So all of the resources that are provided there and the learning modules are all very, very much grounded in evidence and research, as well as, and one of the neat things about it is that when they develop all of this information, they call on people across the country and across the world who are experts in these areas. So I strongly recommend that you use those and you consider sharing them with your whole community of educators. Another area that is vital is general classroom behavioral management and support. So what we find is that all students, regardless of disability status, et cetera, really prefer predictable environments. So they want to know what to expect in their classroom. They want to know what the expectations are for their behavior in the classroom, as well as their academic work in the classroom. And so the more that we can share this with students and teach it early on, the greater likelihood that students are going to be successful. I will also be honest, it also makes teaching a lot easier. It makes teaching a lot easier. It makes for happier classroom environments. And when we think about this, it not only supports those students who are just great students and aren't a problem, but students that have trouble with things like attention or anger or defiance that are the most difficult to include in the classroom actually are more successful when all of these areas of expectation are outlined. So when we design a classroom management system, we really want to focus on a lot of components. And it all starts with setting up clear rules and expectations for students. Some of you may have heard of positive behavioral interventions and supports, PBIS, or MTSS, multi-tiered systems of supports. Special education, we're all about acronyms and it gets very challenging. But when we look at these ideas of supports, we want to provide a base level of support to all students in the school, all students in the classroom that is supportive. And the way we start this when we think about classroom management is thinking about setting up very clear rules and expectations for students and taking the time to teach them to students. So, and also sharing these rules with families so that they know about what is happening in the schools and can support students. So when we think about starting with rules, you want to have very clear, very concise, and positively stated rules. And you don't need a lot of them. So for example, you could start with 3 rules, such as be respectful, be responsible, and be ready. And every single thing that happens in a classroom can fall under those. So if you have a student who calls another student an unkind name, well, that's not being respectful. So that falls into that. If you have a student who is off task or is not completing their assignment, they're not ready. They're not being ready. So we want to have very clear rules. And then what we do is we teach students what this means in all aspects of school in the classroom. So we would say, what does it mean to be respectful during teacher instruction? What does it mean to be responsible during independent work, or even during recess or lunchtime, meal times in school? So, or what about when you are in a center time or sitting on the floor during group work? So we want to make sure students understand what all of those rules mean and look like across the whole day and across all areas of the classroom. And then you also want to set up your classroom space so that students can be successful. Very often, I'll go into a classroom where a teacher is struggling with classroom management, and I find that their students are all too close together. Or I find that students can't see the board or see the instruction that's happening on the board, or that they're distracted by other students in front of them. So we want to set up our classroom spaces so that we can increase accessibility of all items in the classroom, as well as accessibility for the teacher to be able to get to students whenever they need help. We also want to make sure that we are creating spaces that have low distraction, and not distraction by things on the wall, but primarily distraction by others in the building, or in the room rather. And we want to make sure that everybody can see everyone. So that's just the basic idea of setting up your classroom space so that it doesn't have areas in which it can cause troubles in the classroom. And then the next piece of that is routines. So practicing routines with students, things like lining up at the door. How do you transition from one activity to another? Making sure that students learn, how do they get a new pencil if their pencil breaks, or what do they do if they need to go to use the restroom? So setting up strategies and structures and teaching the routines to students. How do you get help? How do you get the teacher's attention? How do you ask for certain things in the classroom, and practicing those? So not just assuming that students know how to do it, we have to take the time to teach it to our students. And then from there, the other piece would be having a very clear schedule. So letting students know what they're doing throughout the day, or letting them know what is happening during this specific class period, and writing down a schedule and letting students see what the expectations are throughout that schedule and walking them through it. That high predictability really creates comfort in a lot of students. And they know that, wow, if this is math and I really don't care for math, it's going to end eventually. And then I get to move on to reading, or I get to move on to recess, even better, recess, right? So the idea is that they know what is coming. Same thing for our older students, because a lot of times you'll have an hour-long block or an hour-and-a-half long block, and letting them know what's happening throughout that block can increase predictability, and also can decrease some behavior problems and increase attention. It seems like such a small thing, but it has so much power. And most of all, and I talked about this briefly before, is providing praise. So I'm about to yawn, I apologize. So we rarely provide enough praise to our students. And as students get older, we really do an awful job at it. So the idea is that we spend a lot of time telling students when they're doing something wrong. But we need to flip that and start telling students when they're doing things that are correct. Even little things like sitting in your seat, if you have a student who struggles with that, or small things like completing an assignment or using kind words to another person. We need to praise that. And we can do that by telling students, hey, you did a really wonderful job helping your friend in the classroom, or wow, you did a really wonderful job of coming into the classroom on time. I'm really proud of you for that. So the more that we can change our wording and focus on the positive, the better. And interestingly, I have, and I'm going to give you a little story, but I have a student in one of my classes who is an international student from Africa. And after our very first behavior class, his first behavior class, he came up to me and said, wow, we don't do that at home. And he said, I'm so excited to learn about a different way to approach it. He said, we're so busy telling, and he's saying, especially the boys, that they're doing things wrong, and getting angry at them. And he said, and it never works. I said, well, there's a reason it doesn't work. They don't know when they're doing the right thing. So we need to spend time. And it was like a big, as we say here, a big light bulb moment. He suddenly said, oh, wait, there's a different way. And I said, yes, the way is to try to focus on what kids are doing right. I'm not saying that if there are problem behaviors, never to address them, but the more that we can focus on the positive, the more we can focus on what students are doing well, it is so powerful. And the best part about it is it's just words and it's totally free. And we've got lots of words, it's unlimited. So the more praise we can give, the better. So I always put a plug in there for praise. And we know also that, I'm not, it's so naive that I think that's the only thing that's going to work. There are some students, pardon me again, who really need intensive interventions, behavioral interventions. And for those students, I strongly recommend that you think about functional behavioral analysis, so FBAs, and designing behavior intervention plans. And that's a very structured way to identify or to hypothesize the why of behavior. Why are students engaging in behaviors, as well as finding the right sort of supports and interventions that would fit those students. But that's a whole specific area of work. So if anybody has more interest in that, I can definitely, you can reach back out to me and we'll definitely talk about that at another time. Hopefully, I'm hopeful. I know Hala and I've already talked about, possibly, connecting on that. So it's very exciting. So I think this is hard because it's so much information. Does anybody have any quick questions about classroom management before I go on to some academic supports?
There are two questions. I'm not sure how quick they are.
Okay, it's okay.
We'll give it a try. So one of our participants is asking about, in regards to learning difficulties, do you think that students really are always having learning difficulties, or is it that they don't want to learn or having negative experiences? The feeling of this participant is that the role of the teacher and the students is to encourage and respect what they need. And sometimes they hate school because of perhaps the behavior of the teachers, or they're disappointing their parents, etc. So how do you weigh in on this?
Yes. So the way that if you can think about this as everybody has a history, right? We all have learned things, and we have a background in what we like to call a learning history in special education. And unfortunately, we get students who come into our classroom who have had very negative experiences in their past, so very challenging learning histories. And so a lot of the time they look as if they don't care about learning or they don't want to learn. And a lot of the times it's just that they have experienced lots of negativity in their past education. So what we have to do is to build in those positive experiences. And when we see students engaging in some sort of an activity in the classroom, and we know they've been a challenging student in the past, but they're doing it really well, you almost have to sort of pounce on them and give them lots of care and lots of positive reinforcement, and try to reverse, or you can't get rid of the past history, but you can build a new one where students get a positive environment in their classroom and they see that they are valued and that you want them there as a student. And when we can give students that belief, and it's not easy, right? Sometimes it takes a lot of time and a lot of patience on the part of teachers. But when we can start building in that positive environment, we do see students shift. And I have never met a student who doesn't want to learn. They may not want to learn the way that you want them to learn, or they may have learned that they can get out of assignments. But I've never met a child at any age who doesn't want to learn. So it's just finding the way to engage that student. Did that answer that, Hala? I feel like sometimes I go into little,
No, I felt that was
Okay,
a
good.
really great reply. So
Good,
thank
good,
you.
good.
Now we'll do one more question if we can, because it ties directly into what you were talking about, routines. So routines are wonderful, but we have a question asking, what about the kiddos in the classrooms that love their routine and predictability, but are not as flexible with disruptions to their
Right.
schedule or routine?
Yes.
So the person is questioning, practicing exposure from low preferred to high preferred and fading that preference transition.
Yes.
Any suggestions for this in a first question? Any suggestions for this in a mainstream setting? And at what point would you begin to look for comorbid conditions?
Right.
Because one thing that they're suggesting is that, especially in the UAE, some of those comorbid conditions are not well diagnosed. So when should teachers start to be raising some red flags?
Yes. So as far as some of our students who tend to be a bit more rigid with their schedules, the way that we often will approach it initially is, if we have schedules that are posted, we really want to have schedules posted so that students can see what's coming. And if you have a shift in your schedule, drawing attention to it early and telling students, okay, usually we go to recess at this time, but we have to shift it. We're going to do it a little bit later today. So if you can draw attention to that and prepare students for those changes, it can be really, really helpful. So sometimes it's okay just to have it written on the board. Other students need to actually have it visually in front of them. So it might be that they have the different activities of the day on pieces of Velcro that are in front of them, and they take it off as they complete it, but drawing attention again to the fact that we really want you to make it through, and we have some shifts or some changes. So I have had students, my own personal students, that have been like that we've had a shift in the day, and we've had to really draw close attention because they don't like any changes in their schedules. So, but we want to draw attention to it, and we want to prepare them for it, as well as build them up and say, you can do this. I know you can do it. And then the moment that you're in that new activity, you're providing lots of reinforcement, telling students, wow, you're doing it. I'm so proud of you. This is great. And then when they finish, just really piling on that reinforcement is very important. And then as far as the low preferred versus high preferred activities. So obviously this person knows a lot about behavioral supports. So just a little background behind that. When we talk about low preferred activities, those are the activities the student doesn't love doing, right? And high preferred activities, those are the things they absolutely adore. So it might be low preferred, might be, I keep picking on math, so we're just going to keep picking on math. Low preferred might be math, and then high preferred might be time by yourself on the iPad. They may love that, right? So that's very common. So what you would do is you would want to put that low preferred activity and say, okay, once you finish 5 minutes of math, you get to have your iPad time. So we want to build up the schedule for certain students that have that low preferred activity where they're earning a high preferred activity. And so you can do that individually with certain students, and build in those break times. And if you've built in those supports and you're providing all of those reinforcements and you've done all of that, and the student is still struggling, still having trouble, then that would be the point where you might want to look and see if there are some other underlying issues. That diagnosis is never going to to sort of be the magic that changes a problem or fixes a problem, but it can definitely add information for you. So you might be dealing with a student who has autism, or you might be dealing with a student who has anxiety, or that has a strong learning disability, and they just really are struggling within certain areas, and they've learned that math is really, really hard. So once you've done those things and you've built in some of those basic supports, that's the point where and it's not working, and you've done a couple of different things, it's time to maybe dig a little deeper. So from there, let's talk a little bit about, I mean, I could spend, honestly, everybody, I could spend hours and hours just talking about behavior, because it's the base of everything. But let's say you have this classroom that you've set up very, very effectively, and you've got all of these supports. We really need to focus on instruction. And there are so many different reading and writing and mathematics strategies. But what I do want to focus on is what we call data-based individualization. So some of you may also know this about as progress monitoring or curriculum-based measurement. So the idea is that what we should be doing, and this is really for all students, and I think this also can speak to the last question about when do we look for an underlying diagnosis of something else. We take data on students' progress, on their reading, on their math skills, on their writing skills, and we continually take those data. And when we see that a student is not making progress, we stop and say, okay, what could I do differently? And that's when you put in some extra supports or some extra intervention. And then you continue to take your data. And if the student is successful, great, then that means that intervention was the right one for that student. But sometimes we notice that the student still struggles. And so we're taking more data and we try another intervention and the student still struggles. So that's when we see that it's probably time to see if there are some underlying issues or any other supports that can be taken. But the wonderful thing about data-based individualization is that we don't just keep doing what is not working for a student. We're always shifting and making changes for those students. And so the more successful and supported students feel in the classroom, the better they end up feeling about themselves too. And so this is so important for students with disabilities, but it's important for all kids in your classroom. So if they see that wow, I'm struggling on reading and you're not going to give up on me, you're going to try something different, that's very meaningful to them. Same thing with the behavioral side of things. So we want to make sure that students are feeling appreciated by teachers, and that they're willing to make those changes within the classroom. And that's actually modeling for the students that are in the classroom, but it's also modeling for parents, and teaching parents that you're not going to give up on their child, and that you value their child. So that becomes a piece of sort of increasing self-esteem and self-worth in that child, but also appreciation for that child within even families and communities. Hala, do we have any other questions right now?
We're muting. Sorry, I'm unmuted.
No, no worries.
Yeah, well, this is shifting a little bit away from individual behaviors. And, I'm aware that you serve on a number of, local and national organizations in the United States. So I think it'd be interesting to understand, how do you feel that educational policymakers can really support inclusive education?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think that in order for policymakers to support inclusive education, they need to understand it. And so I've been very fortunate to go and speak to some of our representatives here in the US, and so our congressmen and representatives, to talk about the importance of supporting students with disabilities, and encouraging neurodiversity in our schools. And it has been amazing to me to see those individuals who really have a great knowledge, and then those who have no knowledge whatsoever. Most people who understand have some sort of a family connection. or a community connection to individuals with disabilities. So the more that we can get out there and expose those who don't have those connections, the better. I've also found that it has been really helpful to have individuals who understand the structures of different policymaking systems in the US on these organizations. So for example, I was referring to the Diverse Learners Co-op. One of our board members actually works in sort of a special ed charter school kind of space as well. She's an attorney. And one of her big initiatives, especially, we'll go back to the pandemic, right, was working with policy organizations to ensure that students with disabilities were still receiving their services even throughout the pandemic. And I attribute some of her work and the work of the organization that she's primarily affiliated with in making sure that all students still got their services during the pandemic, because there was a rush in a lot of states to say, oh my goodness, let's just have a waiver so that we don't have to provide these supports, or we can't do it. And her organization really pushed hard on our Secretary of Education, our then Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, as well as her organizations, like all the organizations she worked with. And she very, very strongly supported continuing supports for students with disabilities and making sure that there were not waivers, that there was no way to get out of that. And because of that, we saw that there was a quick shift to make sure that some education was provided to all students across all disability categories, across all schools, across the whole country. Of course, it was more effective in certain places than others, but we all run into that. But that there was a sort of a no break in those supports, as well as ensuring that if students missed a chunk of education, that they were provided extended school year services and those pieces. So it was a perfect example of the importance of having individuals who have the knowledge speaking directly to policymakers.
And what was it that essentially sold it to the policymakers? Was it just having the awareness? Was it just someone there? Was it data? What was it that?
I think it's all of that, Hala. I think it's all of that. I think it requires to have someone, if I send you an email, you can just get rid of it. But if I'm in front of you and I'm talking about my experience as a teacher, or if I'm a parent and I'm talking about my experience with my child, or I'm an attorney talking about legal requirements, because we have a lot of legal requirements related to special education, that's going to be more meaningful. And then if I have data to talk about learning loss, or I have data to talk about growth in students, if they don't have that break in education, it's so much more powerful, so much more. So I think it takes all of it. It's a community thing.
It's coming prepared.
Very prepared.
Right.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know we're coming to the end here, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I would just like to take a moment to just thank you all for allowing me to speak very briefly on creating supportive and inclusive classrooms for students with diverse learning and behavioral needs. This has truly been an honor, and it's such a vast topic. And so please, my email address is there in the chat. Please reach out to me. And also, once you receive the list of resources, my email will be on that as well. So please, again, do not hesitate. So thank you so much. And this truly has been an honor.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Doctor. And thank you to everyone for attending our event tonight. And we hope that you find it useful. I want to say a big thank you to you, Professor Andrea, for your time and for sharing your expertise with us on effective techniques and practical strategies to embrace diversity and inclusion in the classroom. The U.S. mission continues to engage with educational institutional representatives in the UAE to expand our ties between the U.S. and the UAE. Our education partnership with the UAE is extremely important for building institutional capacity and economic development, and for preparing our youth for careers of the future. In closing this session, the U.S. mission is always open to your ideas on how to expand institutional ties between our two countries. I would like to ask everyone who attended today in the audience, if you could send us your contact information via private chat to AD Cultural Events, which you will see there in the chat. You can just private message that, your contact information. We want to send you emails about upcoming events and things we have going on. Again, you can send us your contact information privately to AD Cultural Events through the chat, and we will keep you posted on all things coming up. And if you could also share with us as well what institution you're with, that way we can stay informed and get you more information as it comes out. Thank you again to everyone, and thank you for your time today. And with that, we will close the event. Take care. Good evening or good morning to wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
I appreciate
Yes.
it.
Thank
And
you,
please reach out if
Andrea.
you need anything.
We'll
Great. Thank
sure
you so
do.
much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for attending. Thank you.